Hello, my name is Steve Bowler, and welcome to Juniper Intermediate System to Intermediate System, IS-IS Lab number 3. In this lab, we're going to take a detailed look at IS-IS Authentication. So the first thing I want to do is explain our network topology. If this looks familiar, this is the same network topology that we used in IS-IS Lab number 2, in which we explained in detail multi-area IS-IS. If you are not familiar with IS-IS Lab number 2, I would suggest that you go back and watch that lab. But if you are not going to be able to watch that video right now, what I'm going to do is I'll just explain the network topology. We have five routers: router 1, router 2, router 3, router 4, and router 5. Router 1 is in area 49.0001. Router 2 and router 3 are, router 2 is in area 49.0024, and router 4 is also in 49.0024. Router 3 and router 5 are both in area 49.0035. Router 2 and router 3 are L1, L2 devices. Router 5 and router 4 are strictly L1 devices, and router 1 is an L2 device. So the links between R1 to R3 and R1 to R2, these are L2. On the other end, between router 2 and router 4, that's an L1 link, and between R3 and R5, that's also an L1 link. So we have three areas in this video. What I'm going to show you and explain is IS-IS authentication on two different varieties. We're going to show you how to configure IS-IS authentication at the level, and then we're also going to show you how to configure IS-IS authentication at the interface level. So you can configure it on the whole level itself, or you can go more specific and configure it at the interface level. And what we're going to see is that if you do IS-IS authentication at the interface level, that is going to take precedence over the per level IS-IS authentication. We are using logical systems in this video for all of our routers. So we have access to one physical Juniper device. We're using logical tunnels to bridge our logical systems together. If you're not familiar with logical systems, you might want to go back and watch my logical systems labs, in which I explain in detail how to set them up, what they're used for. The basic function of the logical system is going to allow us to create connections between multiple virtual routers within one physical router. That way we can run different routing protocols. We can do MPLS VPNs. So logical systems are a great way for you to, if you just have access to one Juniper device, if that device supports the LT interface or the EM interface, then you'll be able to create logical systems, and you can practice creating some labs. So what we have is we have logical tunnels between all of the routers. For instance, between R1 and R2 we're using, and we are showing that all logical tunnels equal LT-1-2-0.XX. So for instance, between R1 and R2 we're using LT-120.12. All the router IPs are going to be as follows. R1 has all .1s associated with it, and the loopbacks are included with that. The net address, for instance, for R1 is going to be 49.0001, because that is the area it's in. And then the system ID is going to be the loopback of the router. So for instance, for router 1 it's 001, 001, 001, 001, and that equals 1.1.1.1, which is router 1's loopback 0.1. So that's a very high-level overview of our network topology. We already have IS-IS configured, and all the interfaces, the IP addressing, everything's already done for us. This is kind of like a continuation of IS-IS Lab number 2. And the first thing we're going to do in this lab is we're going to start configuring simple authentication at level 2 on router 1 and configure trace options. So IS-IS has 3 different authentication types. You can either have no authentication, simple authentication, and MD5 authentication. Simple authentication can be hacked, and so it sends the passwords in plain text with your updates. So obviously that's going to be the easiest way to hack it. If you're going to do MD5, which is the more secure way, that's what most people do. That is the preferred method to go. So what we're going to do first is just show you simple authentication. Obviously this is not the best option. We're going to go to router 1. First, if we just do a show IS-IS, if we do a show IS-IS adjacency on R1, we can see that we are adjacent to router 2 and router 3, and those are both level 2 connections. So what we were going to do is we're just going to set up simple authentication at level 2 between R1, R2, and R3, and configure trace options on R1. Let's just go ahead, and I just want to show you also all the connections on R4. If I do a show IS-IS adjacency, I am adjacent to router 2, and then router 5, if I go on to it and do a show IS-IS adjacency, we are adjacent to router 3. So from router 5, if we look at our network diagram, router 5 has loopback. If we look on R5, we have do a show configuration on R5. We see that we have a loopback 0 unit 5 with the 5 network and the 55 network, both of those /24s. Also router 4 is similar. If we do a show configuration, we have loopback 0.4, our unit 4, with the 4 address and the 44 address, both of those /24s. If we do a show route on R4, you see that we have the default route. So if we try to ping the 5 network and source that from our 4 network, see that we have reachability. And so end to end throughout our network diagram from R4 to R5 we have reachability. Just wanted to show you that real quick. We're going to go back to router 1, and we're going to configure trace options. We're going to go under configuration mode. We're going to do edit protocols IS-IS. Then we're going to do trace options, and if you're not familiar with trace options, they allow us to set real-time events, send them to a log. That way we can check on those later on, or we can monitor them, those events, in real time, just like you were going to do a debug on the Cisco iOS. It's kind of similar to that. We do that by doing set trace options, then we name our file. So we'll do file IS-IS lab 3 R1. And then we're going to do set trace options flag, and this is where we're going to go in and set up what events within the IS-IS routing protocol we want to send to our trace options file. In this case, we're just going to flag all events. Then we're going to match on more specific criteria. So we'll do set trace options flag all. Now that we have that done, within IS-IS, at the edit protocols IS-IS level, we're going to do the command set level 2 authentication key, and then we're just going to set it to Juniper. So that's the first command that we use to configure level authentication within IS-IS. The next one we're going to do is set level 2 authentication, and then if I do a space question mark, we did our authentication key, which was our password. Now we're going to do the authentication type. So if we do authentication type, question mark, we have simple and MD5. And what we're going to show you in this lab is to do simple. I'm sorry, not in this lab, but first, in our first scenario, we're just going to use simple authentication. So we'll do set level 2 authentication type simple. Then we're going to go ahead and commit this change on R1. And now from router 1's perspective, what we're going to see is if I do a show IS-IS adjacency, now we can see the state is down. Before we saw the state up. There's a good command you can use when you are troubleshooting authentication within IS-IS. That command is show IS-IS authentication. If we do that, we can see that we have the interface with the associated level with the interface and the type of authentication that is being performed. So we have simple authentication on R1 for all of our level 2 connections. So that's going to include the connection to router 2 and to router 3. So we're seeing simple all across the board because that's what we configured for level 2. If I do a show IS-IS adjacency, now we see those neighbors have been eliminated, router 2 and router 3. And if we were to go now onto one of the neighboring routers, which is R2, and do a show IS-IS adjacency, what you're going to see is that we have the state as initializing. And that's common to what you might see if you have authentication issues within IS-IS. You'll see one side of the adjacency showing up as initializing in the state. In this case, we see R2. If we go to R3 and do a show IS-IS adjacency, we see the same thing. We see the connection from R3 to R1. We see that adjacency as initializing. So it'll just remain in this state. If we go back to router 1 and do a show log IS-IS lab 3 R1, and then we match this on, let's just say, authentication, what we see in our trace option log that we configured is that we're seeing an error. We're seeing IIH from R3 and R2. We're seeing these hellos from our adjacent routers without authentication. If you're not familiar, IIH means IS-IS hellos. So we're seeing these are showing up on R1 as errors and without authentication to R2 and R3, and that's because we have not configured router 2 and router 3 yet for level 2 authentication. if we look on R3, we do a show route on R3, what we can see is that we have no routes to R2 or R4 learned prefixes. So if we look at the IS-IS authentication on R3, we'll just do show IS-IS authentication. We can see that we have no authentication configured. So the next thing we're going to do, and we can see that our network is broken. If I go back to router 4 and try to ping, now we can see that those pings are not successful. So obviously our network is broken. We have, if we look at our network diagram, router 1 is configured for simple authentication within level 2, but its adjacent neighbors, router 2 and router 3, do not have authentication configured. So now that's what we're going to do next. We'll go to router 2, we'll go under Edit Protocols IS-IS. We're going to set level 2 authentication. We're going to set the password up, so we'll do authentication key. We're going to match the key to R1's. So we're going to do authentication key Juniper. Then we're going to do set level 2 authentication type, and we're going to set this also up to match R1, so we're going to set it to simple. We'll go ahead and commit that on R2. Then we'll go to router 3 and do the same thing. So we'll go under Edit, we'll go ahead and do Edit Protocols IS-IS. We're going to do set level 2 authentication key Juniper. That's going to set up our password to be the same with R1, and then we're going to do set level 2 authentication type as simple. Let's go ahead and commit this. And now if I go back to router 1, if I do show IS-IS adjacency, now we can see that the state has changed to state up for both our connection to router 2 and router 3. If we go back to router 3, do a show route, we can now see that we have the full routing table within our IS-IS domain. We have the routes learned from R2 and R4 again. So we have the complete routing table back on R3. If we do, on R3, if we do a show IS-IS authentication, we can see that for level 2, our level 2 connections, which is the connection on LT 120.31, which is the connection to R1, we see that having simple authentication, and we see no authentication on the link between router 3 and router 5. If I go back to router 4 and do a ping, you can see that we have reachability again. So what we did is we configured level 2 authentication between R1, R2, and R3 on their L2 links. So the next thing that we're going to do is configure MD5 authentication in area 49.0035. If we look at our network diagram, that is the connection, or the area between R3 and R5. That is 49.0035. Before we do that, we'll go to router 5 and do a show route to show you what the routing table looks like on R5. And then we'll also do a quick ping. We'll do ping 44, 44, 44, 44. We'll source this from 55, 55, 55, 55. Do a rapid count of 1,000. And we have reachability. So I just wanted to show you that we had reachability on that end. Before we go ahead, and what we're going to do is set the authentication type in area 49.0035 on the level 1 links. Let's go to router 3. We'll start there. We'll do the command under edit protocols IS-IS. We'll do set level 1 authentication type MD5. That is to specify that we are using MD5 authentication on level 1. The next command we're going to do is set level 1 authentication key, and then we'll just put Bowler CBT Labs. Go ahead and commit this. And on R3, if I do a show IS-IS adjacency, we can see that the connection to R5 is now showing down. On R5, if I do a show IS-IS adjacency, we can see the state as initializing. We saw that before when we did simple authentication on the level 2 links between R1, R2, and R3. When we had R1 configured for authentication and R2 and R3 were missing authentication. So that's not good. If you go in and do a show IS-IS adjacency, you see the state as initializing and not showing any further progress. So first thing I would start doing is looking at IS-IS authentication for different keys configured or different types of authentication on the links or the levels. When I said links, I mean the interfaces, because what we're going to see is that interface IS authentication is going to take precedence over the level authentication. We go ahead and try to ping. We can see that we're getting no route to host. That means we are not successful. So we know that there's a problem, and the problem is that we do not have R5 configured yet for authentication. If we do a show route on R5, we can see that we don't see the default route coming in anymore. If we configure router 5, we have to go under edit protocols IS-IS. We're going to do the command set level 1 authentication. We're going to set the authentication type as MD5. Then we're going to set level 1 authentication key, and it's got to match with router 3, so we're going to set it to Bowler CBT Labs. We'll go ahead and commit the change. And now if I do a show route, just that fast we see the default route being propagated again to router 5. If we go ahead and try to ping across, now we have reachability again from router 4 to router 5, which is our ends of our network. as we can see from our network diagram. And if we do a show IS-IS authentication, we can see on R5 that our interface connected to router 3 is now showing up as MD5 authentication. And the last thing that we want to do in this lab, now that we showed you how to configure MD5 authentication within level 1, we're going to configure MD5 interface authentication on the link between router 3 and router 5. So between R3 and R5, we're going to configure interface IS-IS authentication. The way that we're going to do this is we're going to, if we look at our configuration, if we go under R3 and do show configuration, we can see that the authentication key, just wanted to point this out too, this is very important. We see that we have for the different levels, this is router 3, so we have authentication, we have simple authentication going on within level 2, and then we also have MD5 authentication going on in level 1. We see that the password is encrypted, so that's very good information to know. On R3, we're going to set up interface authentication by, we'll go under edit interface LT120.35. This is the connection between R3 and R5. And then we're going to do the command set, not under the interface level. We'll go under edit protocols IS-IS. Then we're going to do the command set interface LT120.35 level 1, and then we're going to do the command hello authentication type. If we do a space question mark, we're going to follow that up with MD5, and then under edit protocols IS-IS, we're also going to do the command set interface LT120.35 level 1, and then instead of hello authentication type, we're going to do hello authentication key. We're going to set this up as just uppercase of Bowler CBT Labs. We'll go ahead and commit the changes on R3, and now if we go to R3, if we do the command show IS-IS adjacency, we see the connection between R3 and R5 as being down again. So this is where we can see that the interface authentication is going to take precedence over level authentication. If we do a show configuration on R3, we have within level 1 at IS-IS, you see the level 1 authentication is present. Then we also see under the interface our L1 interface, which is the .35 logical tunnel, we see that we have level 1 authentication under it. If we do show IS-IS adjacency, we can see that the connection now is completely gone from router 3 to router 5. So obviously if I go to router 5 and try to do a ping, that ping is not going to be successful. What we have to do is go to router 5 and set it up for interface authentication within IS-IS. So we're going to go under edit protocols IS-IS. We'll do the command set interface LT120.53 level 1, hello authentication type is going to be MD5. Then we're going to do set interface LT120.53 level 1 hello authentication key. Then we're going to match router 3's key, which was capital Bowler CBT Labs. Let's go ahead and commit this. And on R5, if I do a show IS-IS adjacency, we can now see the connection is back up between R3 and R5. If I do a show route, I'm receiving the default route again. And let's see if I can ping. Now we can see that the ping is successful again also. If I do a show configuration, we can see that we have level 1. We have authentication going on within the level, or under the level, and we also have authentication going on under the interface, at the interface level. So that's it. That's Juniper Intermediate System to Intermediate System, IS-IS Lab 3. In this lab, we looked at IS-IS authentication in detail. The first thing we did was on between R1, R2, and R3. Under level 2, we configured simple authentication. We set up trace options on R1 to show you some of the IS-IS events that we were seeing. We then proceeded to show you MD5 IS-IS authentication. We did this in level 1 between R3 and R5. And the last thing that we did was we showed you IS-IS interface authentication also at the MD5 level. And we showed you how that authentication took precedence over our level authentication. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.